Team 16, the very last team for the AFC that I'll be previewing in the 10 and 20-minute series. But I get to sit back and talk to Matt Landis about the LA Chargers in this one. Matt, how are you doing?
Ron, doing well. I'm not sure we can say that you've saved the best for last when it comes to the Chargers and the AFC, but nevertheless, this has been a great series to follow. You've had on some heavy hitters, so definitely some tough acts to follow on my end. Honored to be in esteemed company, and at the same time, I feel like finding a Chargers fan is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. So maybe that says more about me being here than anything I personally bring to the table. But however you want to slice it, it's great to be on with you.
No, it's much more than that. I always enjoy our conversations, and I hope people who listen to us realize how much we enjoy this. And we do this even though last year brought another season of disappointment to LA Charger fans. I mean, it just seems like the word underachieving in LA Chargers has kind of gone hand in hand. Staley's gone now. And maybe with it, there's going to be a change. We got a lot to unpack in terms of this episode. But the very first thing and the very first question I would have to you is Jim Harbaugh's here. Are you excited? What are your thoughts as far as this is a radical departure, a big money hire for the Chargers?
Yeah, so my philosophy when it comes to coaching changes like this, admittedly, might seem boring at first glance, but I found it to be prudent over time. And I really try to do my best to delay judgment. When it comes to things like coaching hires, draft picks, there's so much we don't know, an incredible amount of randomness involved in what works and what doesn't, or who might work in one environment versus another. So I know that those initial words, not the best for views or clicks for this episode necessarily, but it is the most genuine answer I can give. And I will have a stronger opinion in the next 2 to 3 years, if not sooner, based on what we see early on in the Harbaugh era. I just think Exhibit A in this sense for me would be Bill Belichick on the short list of greatest coaches of all time. Fired after 5 seasons in Cleveland, goes 5-11 first season in New England. And from then on, we know how it went. Of course, Tom Brady was a godsend, but Belichick did an awful lot to maximize the strong hand he was dealt. And all that said, Ron, I am still human. I am still a fan of this team, so I won't pretend to be totally immune to the emotional swings that can come with the territory. And in a word, I was thrilled when they sealed the deal with Harbaugh. It's tough to argue against his track record of turning teams around in a hurry and often taking them to new heights. And I think he brings a physical and mental toughness to the table that's sorely needed for the Chargers of all teams in the league, I think you could argue. A slight dose of reality to go with the optimism. The roster still has some shortcomings. I think we'll address those in short order here. So I'm not expecting Harbaugh to bring an overnight transformation from worst to first. I am still expecting some tough losses, which the Chargers seem to specialize in. But at least under Harbaugh, the tough losses should be more about other teams beating the Chargers rather than the Chargers beating themselves. That distinction might sound trivial, but for this organization, that would represent a monumental step in the right direction.
Absolutely. And even before the draft, it looks like they were starting to become Jim Harbaugh-like in terms of roster construction. They got rid of a couple of heavy hitters at wide receiver. They're going to go in another direction that we'll talk about. But they brought in a couple of former Ravens, I believe, in terms of running back. I think they're going to bring in people who could actually tackle. I think they're going to bring in people on the offense that are going to be physical in their run style and what they do. He started molding this team even before we got to the draft.
Yeah, I think that you're alluding to a point I'm not going to push back on in the sense of a transition upcoming to a much more physical team. And a few things telegraphing that beyond Harbaugh's track record itself, the additions of guys like Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, and Will Dissly via free agency, selecting Joe Alt with the 5th overall draft pick to anchor the right side of the offensive line. I do wonder if there's one factor that's drawing a lot of attention to this transformation for the Chargers to a more physical team that might be getting a bit overplayed, and that would be Greg Roman's track record as a run-heavy offensive coordinator. I know you had Adam Chernoff on earlier this week to break down the Jets, and Adam's doing some great work with a team over at Right Angle Sports. Some good from him that led me to Roman Angle might be getting overplayed. Basically, a top-line takeaway of 2 reasons that Roman's Ravens offenses were run-heavy in ways that probably won't apply as much to this year's Chargers team. One, Ravens under Roman had a really stout defense And number two, they were often playing with a lead. So they were managing the clock a lot more than the Chargers might be this season. So all things considered, I do agree there's going to be a transition toward more of a smash mouth style. But I don't know if it's going to be as quick or extreme as a lot of others seem to be expecting. I think it's going to depend on the quality of the defense and game states the Chargers find themselves in. So maybe good defense, favorable game scripts will accelerate the time frame to that kind of style we're expecting from the Chargers. But if we see issues with their defense and the offense playing from behind a good bit, that could prolong the time frame here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You don't want to waste Justin Herbert as quarterback. You want to really play to his strengths. I'm curious as whether the route patterns are going to change with different receivers. But that's something that the draft was pretty much had to address when we talk about my top needs, which are listed on the top of this slide. Right away, with the subtraction of wide receivers, you need 2 more wide receivers. A lot of times when I list my draft choices, top needs for all the teams that I've been doing, I don't list 2 of everything. But the Chargers, I felt, needed 2 wide receivers, 2 defensive backs. They needed somebody on the right side of an offensive line. There's 5 needs listed on there, and those are just the top needs. So there was a roster overhaul. But Matt, I think I sent you a DM during the draft, maybe the first round, and I said, the Chargers are on their way. I mean, they are hitting some needs. So I want to get your perspective of this board. Are these the right people? Were these the right positions? Walk us through your feelings about this draft class.
Yeah, and the DM I remember exchanging with you from the draft might have come on day 2 when they made a trade, because your running joke was that the Chargers were the one team in the league without the phone lines active, and they didn't trade back. They never did that under Telesco, and they haven't done that in year 1 of a draft class under Joe Ortiz. But they did make a move to get Ladd McConkey a few slots earlier than they were originally going to pick on day 2. Overall, with the draft, I will get another obligatory caveat out of the way, kind of like we referenced earlier. I don't expect to have too much conviction on this take for at least a couple years. And Ron, one reason why I'm always hesitant, especially to judge a draft class in its immediate aftermath, want to play maybe a fun, short little game here with you, player A versus player B. So I'm going to put you on the spot. These are 2 players who are both quarterbacks drafted in the top 10 in the last 20 years. Player A's profile. Rookie season, started the conference championship game. Second season, started the conference championship game. Third season, QBR of 42.1, which placed him 26th among qualifying quarterbacks. Fourth season, it got even worse, a QBR of 27.1, ranked second to last in the league. So that's player A and his trajectory after he was taken in the top 10. Player B, rookie season, completed less than 53% of his passes, more interceptions than touchdowns, QBR of 49.8, ranked 25th in the league. Year 2, not a promising turnaround. That QBR actually decreased. And then year 3, he was the runner-up in MVP voting. So Ron, with those clues, any guess as to who was player A and who was player B?
Okay, I'm going to guess Mark Sanchez for player A.
You got it?
Yeah. See, I bet you didn't think I was going to get that one, but this is where age comes in.
The over probably would have been 1.5, maybe shaded slightly under, but now I feel like it's juiced heavily to the over after you pulled Sanchez correctly.
No, I'm not sure about player B. So you said second in runner-up after a couple of bad seasons. I'll have to take a pass on that. I guess I'll say Peyton Manning.
Okay. It's more recent than Mark Sanchez. Player B is Josh Allen. So basically, so under 1.5 does cash, but the Sanchez pull was pretty impressive. And my take home point here is not to say that metrics like won loss record or QBR are perfect, but to me, it just really helps to illustrate how much of a virtue patience can be when it comes to evaluating a draft class. That said, to more directly answer your question and what we're seeing on this slide, my gut reaction is very positive. I'm trying to temper that enthusiasm a bit. I think we have a common framework when it comes to evaluating a draft. Best player available versus team need. I know on the Raiders show with Jared Smith earlier today, you talked about Telesco going best available and taking Bowers in the first round. And it feels like Joe Ortiz with the Chargers here towed that balance pretty well in terms of aligning the best available players with the litany of needs that the Chargers entered the draft with. To me, it was more of a both and rather than an either or in terms of that framework of best available player versus team. Specifically, a couple of names we see here that stood out to me. Linebacker Junior Colson in the 3rd round and wide receiver Brendan Rice in the 7th stand out as value picks that aligned really well with needs the Chargers had. I'll say that even though those seem like value picks, these past couple of draft cycles, I've come across research by Tej Seth of Sumer Sports that suggests quote unquote value picks often don't deliver as much value as you might think. And the takeaway for me there was that when every other team is also passing multiple times on a player, there tends to be a reason for that. So I'm not going to say that Colson and Rice are value picks and therefore we should hold our breath for them or any other guys in this class for that matter to make a drastic impact on day one. Again, ask me in a few years and there's going to be a lot more conviction here, but I do feel quite optimistic off the bat, cautiously optimistic that they drafted well this year. And if nothing else, laid a firm foundation across positions of need in order to start orchestrating a big turnaround for the franchise.
You mentioned need versus value, and I'm going to throw in another concept, and that's person-team fit. Because for me, somebody like Ladd McConkey doesn't have a top 34 grade on my draft board, and I've been putting together draft boards for decades. However, how Ladd McConkey, if he can stay healthy, is going to be used by Jim Harbaugh, I think, is a tremendous fit. Junior Colson, of course, he knows well from Michigan, but his style of play is a tremendous fit. What they want to do with the offense with Joe Alt is a tremendous fit. So it's need and fit versus value. And that's why I think this might have a higher success rate. And since you turned the tables on me a little bit, I want to respond to the Josh Allen comment, because Buffalo did not have a team in place when Josh Allen first got there. They didn't have any offensive linemen worth their weight in gold. They didn't have the wide receivers. They didn't even have running backs. They drafted back-to-back 3rd-round picks at running back. And I believe that your example of Josh Allen fits perfectly for this draft class, because now he's going to build the team around Josh Herbert that maybe he didn't have. A more complete team to the scheme that he wants to run. But we'll see. But I love the focus of this draft.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with the point with coaches as well. It's very tough to predict sometimes who's going to work where, and a lot of it building on the fit, the environment that somebody's placed in can make all the difference. So somebody who fails on one team could really pop elsewhere. Somebody who thrives somewhere could really hit the skids somewhere else. So it looks like the Chargers are, at least from an organizational standpoint, all rowing the boat in the same direction. And in previous regimes, that didn't always seem to be the case. So if nothing else, it's been a refreshing change in the early stages so far.
So that $64 million question is really, how fast does this transition take? From what I've seen on the org chart, Alt starting, McConkey starting, Colson is not yet a starter, but I think he'll play significant minutes and he will start down the line. Maybe even Vidal, the running back, will get some 3rd down carries and stuff. With a transition like this, do you have any experience or do you have any thoughts as to expectations for the Chargers, that can they make this work week 1, week 12, or is it 2025? What are your initial thoughts here?
Sure. Well, I mean, having the Raiders at home and then a road game at Carolina week 2, I hope in weeks 1 and 2, this is looking good. It might be dicier as the season progresses. We'll talk some schedule later, I'm sure. But somebody like Alt, such a blue chip project, the fit we discussed with McConkey, Colson's familiarity with Jim Harbaugh, with Jesse Minter. I mean, he might be the signal caller on the defense if he's ready to go at the NFL level come early in the season. So with the top of this draft class, I do think that there will be a fairly immediate impact. Later on down the board, I think there were some dart throws, and I can't fault the logic of just at least taking dart throws where there are positions of need. So if Brendan Rice is, a big contributor, if any of these other guys we're seeing end up contributing in a big way, I wouldn't expect that to be as immediate as what we might see from the likes of Alt, McConkey, and Colson. So something on the sooner side, especially with the top of the board. And then patience with everybody, let's say maybe from rounds 4 on down.
That makes some sense. And I think the running back room is established enough that they can hit their ground running because they come from the free agency. They already have the NFL experience.
Yeah.
Cornerback
And
Fulton
experience
was
with this
added
type
as
of
well.
regime with Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins.
Yeah. A lot of Baltimore, Michigan connection with this
Mhm.
team. GM, coordinators, coach, so on and so forth. Let's get right into the schedule now before we even talk about season wins and divisional wins, because it's a crazy schedule. It's really interesting to me because their uncommon opponents are nice. We're talking Tennessee, New England, and Arizona. And we're talking about a schedule that opens with a couple of games that are winnable games. But we're also talking about a schedule that has a lot of East Coast trips. What is it? A lot of back-to-back trips, a lot of East Coast trips. I don't know if they're going to stay out east after Carolina and Pittsburgh. Then they have the tough Denver and Arizona trip. So there's a lot of give and take in the schedule. Have you looked at the schedule that much and your feelings about it?
Yeah, my first thought was that they drew the earliest possible bye in week 5. And on one hand, that could be good if they need a bit of a reset. It's kind of a smooth entry with the Raiders and the Panthers, but they have Kansas City early. So if there are any bumps in the road with a new head coach, it can be a nice reset moment. But between a week 5 bye and then ending the season with back-to-back road games, that week 17 game requiring a cross-country trip to New England, if the Chargers make the playoffs as a wild card team, assuming the Chiefs stay atop the division, the wild card round would be their 14th straight week with a game, and it would be their 3rd straight road game. So they might be running on fumes when the games matter the most. I'm not sure that this
Yeah.
is a playoff team, and if they can somehow make everything click, maybe they dethrone the Chiefs. I'm thinking way ahead here, but my first thought was an early bye plus those back-to-back road games. Looking up at the Chiefs in the division, man, if you can even get to the playoffs, how do you have anything left in the tank once you get to the biggest stage?
That's a handicapping tip that I hope people are listening to that Matt just provided is looking ahead to that first week of the playoffs, what happened the previous week or the previous 2 weeks. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that's an excellent point. Let's go to season wins then. Season wins, I've seen mostly 8.5, and it's trending up these days. 140, 144 is the bet. If you like the overs, that's the best I've seen. FanDuel. And then I believe divisional odds, I've seen FanDuel also at plus 350. What are your thoughts in terms of seasonal wins or overtaking Kansas City in the division?
Yeah, at this stage, I'm trying to distinguish my personal opinion and realize the general strength of the market and how sharp markets like these can be relative to any one person's opinion. So sometimes following this team closely, being a long term fan, if I do have some sort of information or a sense that something's not being priced in properly, I'm happy to bet accordingly, either on or against the Chargers. But at this stage, nothing like that is jumping out to me in terms of any inside info that isn't priced in. So I'm looking for discrepancies in odds from book to book. For example, right now, a no vig line at last check on the Chargers regular season win total at a prominent offshore like BetOnline, 8.5 minus 130 is basically, if we take out the vig to the over and the under, 8.5 minus 130 to the over. That translates to roughly 8.75 wins if we're speaking in broad strokes. And if we look at a book like Circa, I last saw 9.5 with a no vig line of minus 155 to the under, and that translates to more like 9 wins. So that's a slim margin. I'm not saying to go and bet it just because Circa has the higher number, especially if it means tying up bankroll for 7+ months. But I do tend to trust Circa as a source of truth in markets like this when the odds are divergent, because they don't limit winning bettors, and taking all comers means they take sharp info that tends to sharpen their lines. So with Circa as the high man on the totem pole, I would lean toward the over for the Chargers regular season win total at that consensus price. I think I'm seeing a lot of 8.5 in the range of minus 145 to minus 155.
Yeah, I think I may mention with Adam on the show there when he quizzed me. I mean, two teams I can't remember ever betting the over on would be the Jets and the Chargers. I mean, usually you're good to go if you're betting the other way on those teams. And it's also unusual for me to be picking more than two overs to begin with. But part of it is, like you said, market perception and where Circa was and so on. Part of it for me is the Chargers are going to be bet, in my opinion. If you even think you like the Chargers, you get them early. And that's kind of what I was thinking even before the schedule came out. I want to get ahead of the game with the Chargers. I feel like if I change my opinion, I can always find a way to get out of it for practically nothing. But there's another adage that I use. I want to get your opinion on that. And that's, let me think if I can put the right words, addition by subtraction. And what I mean by that is basically Urban Meyer and Lovie Smith. And maybe Brandon Staley falls into that too. When you lose somebody that's holding you back and you put in somebody that's at least respectable as a coach, like Doug Peterson or Jim Harbaugh, don't you pick up some wins automatically?
Yeah, I sure hope so. As a fan of this team and trying to think objectively, I follow the logic there. I really am hesitant to put Brandon Staley in the same boat as Urban Meyer, but maybe that's for
Yeah.
more personal reasons. If you actually know what you're looking for on the field, there might be a bit more there. So
Yeah.
I hear you on that front. And I also think you made a good point about trying to time the market on this. I mean, from a market entry standpoint, one more thing that I think is worth underscoring when we're looking at markets like regular season win totals or division odds is that if you want to bet on or against the Chargers in these markets, you don't have to do it before the season starts. A lot of books these days are adjusting for weekly results and keeping these markets up throughout the season. So when it comes to the Chargers schedule, week 1 hosting the Raiders, week 2 at Carolina, week 3 at Pittsburgh, when the Steelers are in the early stages of integrating a new quarterback, I don't feel like we have to squint to see a strong start, especially as you alluded to, if the team stays back east between weeks 2 and 3 for a kind of in-season training camp, if you will. So I feel like if you want to back the Chargers, your approach seems like the prudent one. You're probably going to get better odds the sooner you get down. But I also could totally see some people watching or listening to this conversation just rolling their eyes about another offseason of hype for a team that's never won a championship.
Mm-hmm.
And if you feel like that and you want to fade this team, I totally get it. To quote our good friend Las Vegas Chris, Ron, I would say hurry up and wait if you're looking to fade the Chargers. It's quite possible that you'll get better odds after week 2 or 3, and you also won't have to type your bankroll for quite as long. So the market entry timing is a really fun, relatively new wrinkle into this whole equation with regular seasons wins and division futures as well.
Yeah, excellent point. And because it's becoming more readily available, it's not something that I did until last year with more than one team. I think I had like 7 or 8 different in-season opportunities, and it really presented itself based on the schedule look at and so on. So very good points made there. 2 other things work in the Chargers' favor, in my opinion. Number one, if you look just solely on Pythagorean theorem, and I caution people because this shouldn't always be about Pythagorean theorem because it's built into the price a lot of times now. People are aware of that concept. You have to tie it in with other things. So I think the 4th place schedule plus a team that went, what did they go, 5-12 with a minus 52 point ratio, which really is a closer to like a 7-10 record. So you're picking up 2 games there. You got the 4th place schedule and the uncommon opponents. You're picking up a game there. You're already there before the coaching change and what we might think is a good draft and good free agency. So I think those things bode well in their favor as well.
Yeah, when it comes to the Pythagorean record, the one thing that I wonder about with the Chargers, hopefully it won't apply in the Harbaugh regime, but they tend to specialize in losing close games. So I wonder if there's something that was fundamental to them specifically where a narrow point differential might be associated with a skewed record to the negative. So there's maybe a longer left tail, if you will, for the Chargers in the past. Again, the thought here is that we are going to keep our fingers crossed that that's not going to apply quite so much moving forward.
Yeah, and that's the good follow-up to what I was saying there. That alone may be the close losses turned into close wins. So my final thoughts on here, and then I want to get your comments on these and your own final thoughts, are staff upgrades. So I think we're going to see better in-game decision-making, maybe better 4th down decision-making for this team. The draft needs were met. I do believe that tackling will improve. I mentioned this in the overview when I first started this, is that I want to make some points here that I'm not going to make necessarily to the general public. And you may agree or disagree with them. that's fine. But I do think this team, because of Harbaugh's style, regardless of whether they run a lot or pass a lot, because I could see the pass patterns being different and the tackling being better, I think we're going to see lower scoring games out of the Chargers. I think in general, depending on the opponent, that you can look to bet some unders on the totals in games with the opponents. And I also do think that 8 or 9 interceptions that they had defensively, that's going to go up higher. They're going to play a different style of defense. I think you're going to see more turnovers created by the Chargers. Those would be my nuggets. I said there'd be scheduled challenges, but overall, my biggest key this year, Matt, is Harbaugh's an emotional guy. And he's going to have if he beats Kansas City and then they're flat the next week, if they play Atlanta, I think there's a couple of flat spots on the schedule. They go to Denver, then they have to stay on the road to Arizona. They go play the Falcons after playing the Ravens on a Monday Night Football. That's my biggest key, Matt, is how they handle the ebbs and flows.
Yeah, I feel like Harbaugh is probably the guy to best manage that relative to anybody they've had coaching the team, maybe since Marty Schottenheimer. So I am confident in their ability, at least emotionally, to navigate some of those nuances in the schedule. To your point about turnovers that could see a positive swing in terms of interceptions for the defense, I'm reminded of, I think it was a 49ers team several years ago. They might have had 1 or 2 interceptions over the course of an entire season. There was a comically low number, and everybody just assumed the following year that defense would be terrible again, and they weren't. And turnovers can be very random. They're, of course, very impactful to the outcome of a given game, but they're not always super predictive. So I'd be curious to look at the Charger stats. I haven't referenced them leading up to this conversation, but a friend of mine doing some really good work in this space, Ed Fang of the Power Rank, he has a stat called bad ball rate, where he kind of assumes interceptions are largely noise, but anytime a defense gets a hand on the ball, and that could be because the quarterback was careless and put the ball in a bad spot. It could be just because the defense is very skilled and maybe they're deflecting passes that don't turn into interceptions. Over time, the percentage of bad balls that see the defense get a hand on the ball do tend to have a relatively sticky percentage of plays that turn into interceptions. So perhaps the Chargers were unlucky in that department last year, kind of like that Niners defense from years ago. And sometimes basically the same amount of talent can produce a drastically different result.
Minus 24 turnovers for San Francisco that year. At 3.5 points per turnover, they basically gave teams 84 points. So there was automatically inherent advantages to betting them either the spread or season wins that year. Even if they were minus 10, they were going to pick up 14 extra turnovers. So that's a good reference in terms of 2 interceptions. It's not going to happen the next year. Do they make the playoffs? Yes or no?
Man, this is a tough question because, again, I like to anchor to Circa as a source of truth. Their no vig line, last time I checked, came out to even money. So a true coin flip here. As a bettor, I would be inclined to take plus money in either direction if I could find it. And as a fan, man, I'm traumatized. How could I not be by the Chargers' history of failing in spectacular fashion in the past? But nevertheless, Ron, I'm going to say I'm cautiously optimistic for a lot of reasons we've discussed here around the coaching changes, the draft class. And when I look at the competition, the Chiefs are the only foreseeable threat out of the West. Houston, the only team favored to make the playoffs out of the South. The AFC North is a loaded division, likely at least a couple teams with Baltimore and Cincinnati leading the way. The AFC East also has a few contenders in the Bills, Dolphins, and Jets. So the playoff picture looks crowded before the season's even started. I also feel like we can bank on 1 or 2 surprise contenders that we haven't even discussed yet. And conversely, I feel like we can probably bank on 1 or 2 presumed contenders fizzling out. I wouldn't be shocked if the AFC East only sends 1 team to the playoffs. Maybe that cracks the door open for a team like the Chargers. So I'm going to give you, Ron, a tentative lean toward them making the playoffs. That's just the optimist in me, perhaps. But if I try to be as realistic as possible here, my realistic hope for the Chargers this season, playoffs or not, is simply to see a team that competes and can finally rise above the epic self-destruction that we've seen from them way too often in the past.
I'm intentionally, my fault, going a little longer here because I have one final question for you. Is there anything you're looking for? And I do this with a bunch of teams, so I'm curious, in August before game 1 that you want to see out of the Chargers that you might, something out of August that might tip you one way or another?
I think two things that stand out. One, I'm curious to see what happens with the offensive line. How does Joe Alt fit in? What does that mean for the battle between Trey Pipkins and Jamari Sawyer at right guard? Is Zion Johnson finally starting to live up to the high draft capital the Chargers invested in him? So how is the offensive line coming together? There is a little bit of continuity with Rashawn Slater being an anchor at left tackle, but a lot of other puzzle pieces to slot in. That seems to be a specialty of Harbaugh's, but really want to see how that unit seems to gel. And then we also had a note in the chat near the beginning of the show, Dan Rivera, our good friend, talking about Quentin Johnston getting another year to develop after being so raw coming out of TCU. And I am cautiously optimistic. I mean, I feel like we can only see improvements. I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that we see market improvement out of Quentin Johnston, because Palmer as the leading receiver with any NFL experience after the three guys they picked up in the draft, that wide receiver core is going to be interesting to watch as well. So how quickly does McConkey seem to develop any chemistry with Herbert? Are we seeing any legitimate strides out of Quentin Johnston? If they're going to lean on Josh Palmer to be their alpha, then that's going to put a pretty firm cap on what this offense can do. So I guess the defense with a new DC and some moving pieces, also a bit of a wild card, but defense can just be sticky year to year, even with continuity across the roster and the coaching staff. So really focusing on the offense, what are we seeing in training camp out of the offensive line and the wide receiver core in particular?
Agree completely. Absolutely with those points. So Matt, as always, it's a lot of fun doing this with you. I really appreciate your comments. I think the Chargers are one of the most fascinating teams that we're going to be watching this coming year for a number of reasons. I'm cautiously optimistic about the playoffs as well. It's going to be great. Thanks, Matt, for contributing to my 16th and final AFC team. I'm going to be resuming this on June 10th, the week of June 10th with the NFC. Sipping some drinks in Hawaii in the time between now and June 10th. So aloha to everybody. Come visit my YouTube page, watch this one and all the other shows, and we'll see you back in June.